as Hillary said, I'm an ecologist, and I've long been convinced of the importance of preventing the invasion of non-native species and their control once they become established. And like most ecologists, I've mostly justified these actions based on the biological or ecological effects that these non-native species have. But I believe that these arguments, the biological and ecological ones, are really only part of the calculus that's used by either agencies or legislators to allocate funding. And we as invasive species biologists may be missing an opportunity to expand our justification for action of invasive species, because we perhaps aren't doing enough to consider the economic impacts of invasive species and using that in our calls for action. So what do I mean by this? You know, if we think ourselves, if you think about why you think you should prevent or control invasive species, I think I can actually probably give a good guess by taking a look, believe it or not, at your feet. Next slide, Troy. Maybe not on a snowy day like today, but if you have mud on your boots, then I think you're probably thinking like I traditionally do, thinking in terms of what are the biodiversity implications of invasive species. You want to preserve ecological integrity, minimize the human impacts on the environment, or that there are moral reasons why you want to avoid that. If, on the other hand, next slide, you're wearing loafers or the gender appropriate equivalent, then you may be thinking instead about the economic impacts that invasive species have, the cost of control of invasive species versus the benefits that control is going to do, and how the public views the public's value of whatever those actions may be. And so today I'm going to put on my own loafers and talk about that viewpoint and how it can be useful to achieve our goals. And I think what you'll see is that there are compromises, but I think that in balance they can wind up being in our favor. And so I'm going to talk about this kind of to a little bit of introduction about the economics of invasive species and some of the language and definitions that are used, and then maybe what some of the conclusions and directions are going to be. So what are the economic justifications for the control of non-native invasive species, or the NIS there in my title? Well, one important term is externalities. This is a term that economists use a lot. And it's an idea where one group of economic factors is influencing another suite of processes. And this is viewed by economists as a market failure. And there are actually a lot of environmental issues that deal with these kinds of externalities. So pollution, carbon emissions, for example, are examples, textbook examples of externalities, where, for example, General Electric produces PCBs in the manufacture of whatever their products are, and then they leave them behind for other people to suffer health effects or to need to clean up and so forth, so that the cost of that pollution is not factored into the cost of whatever it was that was made in producing those PCBs in the first place. And as I said, that's typically seen by economists as a market failure, as something to be avoided. Next slide. And that is indeed something that invasive species are an externality. So for example, the emerald ash borer and its effects on forests place a cost onto the timber industry or homeowners who are going to lose their shade trees, or the public for the impact on their, the aesthetics of the forests and their recreation and so forth, or in terms of the taxpayers. And so that's the kind of thing that we typically want to avoid, or that economists want to avoid. And there are strategies to dealing with externalities. Fees and regulations or penalties are typically put into place to try to return the burden, or put the burden in the first place onto the people who are causing the problem in the first place. So the fact that GE is now cleaning up its PCBs is an example of how you might try to reverse those externalities and not simply place the burden onto people in another industry who want to use the river, for example. So that's one reason that's often given for trying to control, for trying to factor in economic conditions into something like invasive species. Another one is to try to balance both the costs of control with what those benefits are. So to try to have some sort of cost benefit, to have both sides of the equation when trying to come up with the best policy. So the first bullet there, the costs of control are easily calculated. Agencies and legislators very easily know how much it costs them to do any kind of control in terms of personnel, in terms of facilities used, and so forth. But the benefits of those policies, including avoidance of costs, are often assumed to be zero. That is, they don't have as easy a dollar for accounting purposes, and so without any estimate, then they assume that the benefits of whatever control are going to be nothing. That makes advocacy very difficult in terms of trying to compare those costs or trying to get around to putting in place a particular policy. So let me show you an example of that. So port inspections for forest pests or lots of other kinds of pest agricultural ones as well is a policy that we can think of in these terms. So I have here, pictures of two pests that are the type, either that are already here or that could come again at another point and cause significant economic impacts. The cost of trying to put those port inspections in place, next slide, are, for example, in fiscal year 2012, the federal government spent about $862 million on agricultural quarantine inspections and customs and ballast inspections. So those are very clear costs of these controls. And in a period of difficult budget times, it's one that I'm sure comes into question as to whether we really need to spend that. And that's probably only a portion of the costs. Then in addition to those direct costs, there are probably also indirect ones as well. On the left side of the table there, delays in shipments due to the inspections, the potential ban on certain imports, and so forth. And so often those costs of whatever policy are debated in a vacuum without a whole lot of discussion of what the benefits of that policy is, or, again, the costs avoided. That is, if we have this policy in place, then we don't have to spend money in the future on something else. So the kinds of things that might appear on the right side of that table are the fact that if we have those policies in place and we're successful in keeping out forest pests, we may avoid the loss in timber value. We may avoid the loss in home value. We may not have to limit trade within regions of New York or the Northeast due to quarantined areas. And we wouldn't have to spend money to restore areas that have been impacted. Those are the kinds of things that can wind up offering the other side of the equation in the cost-benefit analysis. So, so again, those benefits of the prevention versus the cost of inspections can be, should be an important part of the discussion. And they also come a little closer to avoiding those externalities and market inefficiencies that the economists typically try to avoid. And there's actually models for making the people who are causing the externalities in the first place pay for it in the form of, duty fees or and the like, that once you start thinking of it in those terms, that you can maybe even come up with models for how you're going to wind up paying for whatever that policy is, besides just spreading the burden over the entire tax base. Next slide. So another example that along the lines that we tend to think of as invasive species is, what about restoring a habitat that's already been invaded? So let's take, for example, efforts to control water chestnut. So according to the Lake Champlain Basin Program, over $200,000 is spent annually on control of water chestnut in Lake Champlain. And those costs are, I think, easily justified ecologically, and that tends to be an ecological have ecological benefits in the form of lower dissolved oxygen. That is, if we can, the expansion of water chestnut can wind up lowering dissolved oxygen, it can wind up altering the aquatic carbon cycle, it can wind up decreasing fish populations, and those are kind of the ecologist perspective on why we need to have control of water chestnut. Putting it into the economic terms, we can describe it in terms of we would have healthier commercial fish populations and we would have higher recreation values for the public. And that, in essence, winds up being an alternative description of justification for the control beyond just the purely ecological. So how do we do that? How do we convert those ecological values into the economic ones? And the concept of ecosystem services is a very useful one and one that's growing in interest as a way of trying to translate those ecological values into economic terms. And ecosystem services are the benefits that are provided to human society by natural systems. And this comes not exclusively, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment really formalized it in a very effective way in terms of thinking first about direct benefits that we get. So for example, provisioning services that are provided by ecosystems include the food that we get, fresh water, pharmaceuticals, energy, and fiber. Ecosystems also regulate many things that are very important to us. They regulate atmospheric chemistry, they regulate water and flood conditions, pest control. And then we also derive direct cultural benefits, aesthetics, heritage, recreational opportunities, and spiritual benefits from natural ecosystems. Those are all things that may or may not have an actual market, may or may not be easy to put a dollar value on, but they're certainly all benefits that we get from natural ecosystems. Those are then supported by more indirect things, indirect benefits. Nutrient cycling, seed dispersal, and primary productivity are things that are not directly benefiting us, but benefit us through those other direct benefits. So nutrient cycling supports the provisioning, supports regulation, supports the cultural ones. And then finally, the last one is the importance of biodiversity, which on the left-hand side there, which supports all of them. In order to be able to support or provision or provide the provisioning or the regulation, we have to have the species in place in order to be able to support those. From an invasive species context, how can invasive species affect all of these? Examples of provisioning services that can be affected by invasive species are defoliating insects killing timber species. In terms of regulation, it could be something along the lines of disease-altering food chains that regulate pests. In terms of cultural, it could be the aesthetics of walking through a botanical area, without the exotic species. Also, certainly the vulnerability of ash trees is something that baseball fans may in the future wind up paying attention to because of the loss of the traditional ash bats. Indirect services, nitrogen fixers may actually increase rates of nitrogen cycling. It's important to acknowledge that sometimes invasive species may actually increase the value of some of these. And then also biodiversity, obviously by altering the number of species either up or down, by adding or deleting species, it can have a whole range of effects on the ability of ecosystems to give benefits to society. There have been some efforts to try to put this all together and to collect this information into a summary estimate of what are the costs of invasive species. And David Pimentel at Cornell University has probably done the most careful of these. And he's estimated that nationwide, non-native species cost us about $120 billion per year. That's an often cited number And he actually also looked more specifically within just New York at the aquatic invaders into our Hudson Canal System and Great Lakes watersheds, and estimated that those aquatic invaders cost us about $5.7 billion per year. So when we look at a table from one of those papers, from one of those Pimentel papers, we see on the left there, you see the suite of species, and on the right, the damages and or the control costs. And nationwide, those aquatic invaders were estimated to cost about $14.2 billion per year and $5.7 billion in New York. There are some caveats associated with all of those numbers that I've mentioned, though, the $120 billion, the $14.2, and the $5.7 billion. And that caveat is the fact that with just a few exceptions, the fisheries and with the zebra mussels and the Asian clam, almost all of the costs derive from the cost of removal. They're really that cost of dealing with the invasive species that rather than what the impacts of the invasive species on the ecosystem services are. And that, I think, can wind up leading us into a very circular argument, a very tautological argument, where we're saying invasive species cost $5.7 billion, so we must spend money to control them. And it, isn't as good an argument if we have other ways of quantifying what those impacts are going to be. So as it is right now, the current balance in terms of the cost-benefit analysis is very much weighed towards the costs of control. We know a lot more about what the costs of control are than we know about what the benefits of control are. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to fill in a lot more of the details on the right side of that balance to understand what the benefits are. How do we do that? Well, I think in order to do that, we need to better document what the direct and indirect benefits of natural ecosystems are. So figure out what those ecosystem services are, including the direct values of forests and aquatic ecosystems and agricultural resources, as well as the indirect and non-market values, such as the cultural benefits and so forth. We then would like to see how invasive species are going to change those values, either increase them or decrease them. And so the title of my talk, kind of tongue-in-cheek, is borrowed, and please don't tell my parents this, borrowed from Donald Rumsfeld when he was talking about the conditions in the Iraq War. He was dividing up the goings-on in Iraq in terms of known knowns, that is categories for which we had pretty good estimates, known unknowns, category that we know are important, even if we don't have estimates for them, and then unknown unknowns, categories that we don't even know we need to worry about yet. And so let's talk about each of those with respect to invasive species. Our known knowns in this context are the control costs. Those are things that appear in budgets and that we have pretty good guesses for. We also have some good idea of the direct impacts of some high-profile invaders, and those are certainly useful, but it is not giving us the full picture. The known unknowns include the fact that we know that we would like to know more about the value of ecosystem services that natural ecosystems provide, but we really don't have that yet. Particularly lacking are the aesthetics and other non-market values in terms of what the value that the public places on native species, on uninvaded habitats and so forth are. And how do non-native species wind up impacting these values? And then finally, the unknown unknowns are the fact that the very next cargo shipment could bring in the next invasive species, which is going to have impacts that we haven't foreseen, and categories of ecosystem services that we haven't considered. And so that is something that we just have to be ready for. We have to be flexible in terms of our thinking about these sorts of things. So from that, I think that I'll put back on my muddy boots and finish by talking more as an ecologist and say that I think that we can perhaps predict some classes of invasive species that are likely to be high impact invaders from this kind of analysis. It includes ones where their ranges are expanding, ones that are still spreading, that are kind of emerging invaders. especially ones that are directly tied to specific resources that we can measure. Defoliating insects and their effects on timber resources, zebra mussels and their effects on fisheries or the intake into power plants and so forth are ones that are likely to have kind of high impacts on monetary values. Ecosystem engineers like the Chinese midden crab or feral pigs, or ones that are affecting vital ecosystem functions to the extent that the white nose syndrome or something like it that might affect pest control and therefore the transmission of disease or our enjoyment of the outdoors, or something that might affect pollinators. There have been modeling of the invasion of mites that affect honeybees in Australia that show high impacts. Those are all some of the classes of invasive species that I think have, that are going to wind up with this formal analysis looking like ones that are highly valuable and have tremendous risks in this cost-benefit analysis. We can also perhaps identify ones that are going to have less of an impact or less likely to have a high impact. So ones that are already widespread, where the barn door is already opened, I think that it could be more difficult using the way this economic analysis is done to demonstrate economic damage, or that the damage compared to the cost of control is going to be difficult to justify in purely economic terms. Furthermore, species that have subtle aesthetic or ecological effects are going to be ones that probably don't rise to that same monetary impact. And I hate to say this as a plant ecologist, but I think that a lot of the plant invaders, ones that are inserting themselves into forest understories, are ones that are not going to have really demonstrable monetary impacts. So just to bring the other plant ecologists, I'll have something more to say about that in a minute, but let me just conclude with what I've been saying about the economics. I think there are advantages of creating a full picture of the costs and benefits of invasive species policy, but it does require a conversion of ecological effects into monetary terms. I think it'll increase the justification for action with regards to some pests, but not necessarily others. And so finally, to put my muddy boots back on and to my own feelings of justification and motivation for why I study this, those muddy boots arguments are still valid. I'm not saying to get rid of that. That the biodiversity, the ecological arguments for action with regards to invasive species should still be part of the conversation, as they always have been. But I think that there is an opportunity for us to offer multiple justifications, including both the ecological and the economic at the same time. So with that, last slide, I think, Troy. I know that these slideshows get posted, so I wound up placing some of the citations for information I used for this presentation that I've found useful when I've looked into this, so that people will be able to take a look at them. But with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and if there's time, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Great.